Hello, welcome to NEWS.am. I am Alexanian. Former State Minister of Artsakh, Ruben Bartanians, along with other former officials of Artsakh, has been detained in Azerbaijan for nearly 2 years now. Concerns continue to grow in Armenia as sham trials continue in Azerbaijan. To see what's going on and what can be done to help, I'm sitting today with someone who has been directly involved from the very start. Genser, Ruben Bartanians, international legal counsel and international human rights lawyer. Thank you for joining me here in Yerevan, though you are based in Washington.
Thanks for having me.
So this photo on the monitor is from yesterday's court hearing. I want us to start with any recent information you have regarding Ruben Bartanians' overall health condition.
Look, I think Ruben has been through a lot, as have all of the other political prisoners and POWs. They're not well cared for. You can see that Ruben has lost an enormous amount of weight, and he's had a very difficult time, I think, at various points in time, in light of how he and the others have been treated. The reality is that the International Committee of the Red Cross, which used to be able to regularly visit him, are now no longer operating in Azerbaijan. This is an enormous problem because they have been really the only independent monitor capable of seeing what's going on and lodging concerns with the government as they have come up. And so we're very concerned about Ruben's health and welfare and that of the other Armenian political prisoners and POWs. It's an enormous concern.
So there is no international monitoring right now for the Armenian prisoners. What should be done to ensure their rights are protected?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think the reality is that Azerbaijan is well known to be an authoritarian regime. There are also more than 350 Azeri political prisoners who are detained in the country as well, because Aliyev is, I think, afraid of his own people and what they might do if they actually were able to have a free and fair election. So it isn't a unique problem for the Armenian prisoners that they're going through, but it's especially bad for the Armenian prisoners. And the fact, for example, that Ruben and the others can't even have access to a Bible as Christians, I think is really deplorable. The reality is that I think we need to shine a bright light on what's going on there and talk about their situation and what they're going through. Unfortunately, the secrecy associated with how they're being treated is very similar to what's going on with their so-called legal processes, right? Ruben Bartanians has been on trial now, for more than 6 months at this point before a military tribunal, which is closed to the public. Lots of so-called evidence is being presented that has no validity of any kind. People saying that they were injured, but having no connection to Ruben in any way at all. The media can't come to these trials. Independent monitors can't come to to this trial, to the other trials, and so forth. So it's a closed society, and that's the way in which the Azeri regime is conducting these trials.
And just yesterday, the court denied Ruben Bartanians' petitions. Several of them, including the one to provide his family with the indictment.
Yeah, I think, the due process abuses in the case have been, very consistent and highly egregious. As a matter of international law, for example, a military tribunal does not have the competence to try a civilian. Ruben never served in the military and yet is being tried before a military tribunal. And this is because military judges and military prosecutors under international law are not considered independent and impartial because they, of course, report to the commander-in-chief, which, of course, is President Aliyev. So at the outset, the entire process is flawed. It doesn't matter what they present in that court. Any conviction would be illegal and in violation of international law. But, repeatedly, he's been denied access to translated materials, his counsel as well. They barely know what the charges are, against him. He hasn't, been able to engage in the legal process really in any meaningful way at all. And at this point, the judges aren't even following Azeri law in how they conduct the case, right? As a matter of evidence, for example, no witness should be presented unless they have first-hand information about an alleged crime that Ruben Bartanians has committed. And yet we've literally seen 150, 200 so-called witnesses who are people that were purportedly injured in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and their claims, that they were injured, and they talk about their injuries, and they present evidence from doctors that they've been injured, but not a single one of them knows Ruben. None of them have said they know him. They've never seen him. They've never met him. They have no connection to him at all. And their only so-called information about his involvement and his responsibility for these so-called crimes is that they've heard, in the media that he's responsible and he's been blamed by the Azeri regime, so they blame him. Well, that would not be considered valid evidence in any court of law. I'm sorry?
Because of his Armenian origin.
Well, because of his Armenian origin and because this is what the government has told him to say, right? But in any ordinary court, for example, if I were to say, I heard from my friend that, you ran that person over on the street, right? That would not be allowed in any court of law as evidence. They would want someone who witnessed you doing it, saying, I saw you doing that on the street, right? And in this case, literally not a single one of them has provided any evidence of any kind that he actually did anything that he's been accused of, right? So, again, he's now had more than 20 hearings, 21 hearings now, in fact. They've all really gone the same way. It's just going on and on and on. And I don't know who the Azeri regime is trying to fool with this proceeding. Really, nobody believes this to be a legitimate or valid proceeding. And that doesn't even get into the substance of the charges against him, which of course are all politically motivated and invalid as a matter of international law as well.
The fact that they are politically motivated, we do understand in Armenia.
Of course.
But what should be done that the international community would also understand the absurdity of this whole process?
Look, I think it's well understood that that Aliyev detains many political prisoners, both his own as well as Armenians. And so I think that it's really about how do we ultimately get to a position where we can get the Armenian prisoners out. And I think that's where, unfortunately, this is not really a legal question or a set of legal questions. These are really political questions, right? And ultimately, what we need to have happen is a concerted effort by the international community to put the kind of pressure on Aliyev that he decides that continuing to detain the Armenian political prisoners and POWs is no longer sustainable for him, right? And I will say that there's a lot of pressure coming down on him from Washington and from President Trump, which I think has been very, very constructive and helpful. And the reality is that, the Trump administration has made clear to Aliyev that the Armenian Christian prisoners need to be released, the POWs need to be released, either at the same time of or before the potential of any peace deal being signed and being entered into force. And I think that this is the kind of pressure really that's necessary that will force Aliyev to think differently about the situation. Otherwise, this is just more of the same.
But since we don't see any results right now, are these just announcements, or is there any real pressure on Azerbaijan from the U.S. authorities?
Well, there have been a number of public statements that were made that I think demonstrate quite clearly that pressure is being placed on Azerbaijan. You had the U.S. National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, for example, talking about his discussion with the National Security Advisor of Azerbaijan and saying it was conveyed that the prisoners needed to be released. We know that envoys for President Trump have conveyed that privately to Aliyev as well. And the White House is engaged in a lot of behind-the-scenes work to try to get a peace deal into effect and ultimately to secure the release of the Armenian Christian prisoners. Working on these cases is very much like the proverbial iceberg. You only see about 10% above the water and 90% below. So what I can say is that I have more hope now than I have had in a long time that we're moving in the right direction, that Aliyev understands that he needs to come to a peace deal and that there'll be consequences if he doesn't. And ultimately, that obviously the prisoners need to be released at the same time of or before such a deal comes into effect.
What's the price for Aliyev for keeping the Armenian prisoners?
Well, up until this point, there has not been much of a price. But ultimately, I'm quite convinced from the discussions that I've been having with key people in the Trump administration that that's going to change if a peace deal is not reached and if the prisoners are not freed. So, I think that there are lots of options that are being considered and discussed. I'm obviously not in a position to speak in any detail about any of that. Obviously, you could direct questions to the Trump administration and ask what they intend to do. But I will say that from the discussions that I've been having with senior officials in the Trump administration, I am convinced that they're focused on this issue. It is a top priority. And, President Trump has made very, very clear to Aliyev that the Armenian Christian prisoners need to be released. Obviously, Aliyev will have to make his own decision about what to do, but I think there's a lot that he wants from Washington. I think he'd like to meet President Trump in the Oval Office. I think he'd like to see the sanctions lifted. None of these things are going to be possible unless a peace deal is reached and unless the prisoners are released.
What should the Armenian authorities do?
I have had concerns that I've expressed in the past about how strongly Prime Minister Pashinyan is engaged on these issues. Of course, I'm not aware of everything that might be happening behind the scenes, but I am concerned, that, for example, the issue of the prisoners is not in the peace agreement. I'm also concerned that if a peace agreement is reached, my understanding is that the peace agreement talks about the need for all cases at international tribunals to be dropped at both sides, right? And that no cases that relate to those prior claims can be raised going forward. And this is really important to understand because it means that if a peace deal is reached before the prisoners are freed, Azerbaijan would not only have to drop their cases at international tribunals, but could not raise to Azerbaijan any of these cases. Right, so it is absolutely critical that the prisoners be released before at the same time as an agreement, because otherwise they're going to be stuck there really indefinitely, and the government of Armenia would be prohibited from raising their cases or expressing ongoing concerns. So we need a peace deal that is comprehensive. The only way you could have a peace deal that is sustainable over time is if all of the outstanding issues have been fully addressed at the time of or before a peace agreement is reached. And this means that we really need Prime Minister Pashinyan to insist that this is exactly what needs to happen. Because if it doesn't happen, then that would be the equivalent to simply abandoning them to their fates in Azerbaijan.
Unfortunately, just days ago, the Foreign Minister of Armenia announced that there are no talks about the prisoners with Azerbaijan because Azerbaijan denies such talks, denies having such talks.
Yeah.
I guess this raises concerns even more.
I mean, obviously, I can't speak to what might be happening in any discussions between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but I can say that I'm very aware that the Trump administration is putting pressure directly on Aliyev, to him directly and personally, as well as through intermediaries, that the Armenian Christian prisoners are going to need to be released. So whatever might be happening between Armenia and Azerbaijan, there's a third party here in these discussions, which is the United States. And even before President Trump was elected, he put out a True Social post where he described what had happened in Artsakh as ethnic cleansing. And he also said that, as president, if elected again, and of course he has been, that he would stand up for persecuted Christians around the world. And everything that I've seen coming out of the administration since President Trump's inauguration has been consistent with that prior commitment. Obviously, until it's done, it's not done. We are still far from ultimately an agreement in the release of the prisoners. We're not there yet. But I am convinced that it's a top priority for the Trump administration. And if Aliyev would like to see a positive relationship with the United States, I'm very much convinced that that would require the release of the Armenian Christian prisoners. And that relationship is not going to improve unless they're ultimately freed.
To just sum it up, what do you think, what should be done?
Obviously, we need pressure from all like-minded governments from around the world to be putting as much pressure as possible on Azerbaijan to come to the table. My strong sense is that Armenia wants an agreement, would be prepared to sign the agreement now. I think it's well understood in Washington that the claims that are being made by Aliyev about how the Constitution needs to be changed or this new quarter needs to be created or whatever else, that these are just excuses to try to buy time and to kick the can down the road. And I think that I know the United States is getting quite frustrated and concerned about that. And it's well understood in Washington that Aliyev is the problem, not Prime Minister Pashinyan. But we do need Prime Minister Pashinyan to insist in his discussions with Washington and to continue to speak publicly about the need for the release of the Armenian Christian prisoners and to commit publicly to say that he will not sign a deal unless those cases have been resolved. That would help a lot, I think, in terms of putting the right kind of political messaging forward about what's ultimately going to be necessary. Whether Armenia and Azerbaijan are talking about this or not is really neither here nor there. Ultimately, what's going to matter is what happens, right? And there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes in terms of thinking through from a lot of different perspectives what the consequences will be for Aliyev if he ultimately doesn't sign a peace deal and if he doesn't release the prisoners. So I am convinced that things have changed dramatically. Under President Biden, the administration's position was dramatically different, right? The position of the Biden administration was, we're trying to facilitate this peace deal between both sides, and if neither side wants an issue on the table, we're not going to insist that it be on the table because we're just trying to facilitate the agreement. And by contrast, the Trump administration's position has been very clearly to both sides. We expect that a deal is going to be signed. We expect that that the Armenian Christian prisoners are going to be released, and this has to happen as a high priority. So again, getting from here to there is obviously the trick, but I would say overall, the Armenian people need to continue to speak out publicly about the need for the release of the prisoners and the priority of their freedom. Yes, of course, nobody wants to see another war. Yes, peace is very, very important, but the question is peace at what price, right? And once a peace deal is signed of any kind, Aliyev is going to say, there's nothing more for me to discuss with Armenia about anything at all. It's all been resolved with a peace agreement. And so if there's any outstanding issue, If the prisoners, for example, were not released before at that time, then they're going to spend the rest of their lives in prison because there won't be even issues that Pashinyan could even raise to Aliyev. And Aliyev is going to say, look, we have a peace deal, it's done, don't talk to me about anything else. So it has to be a comprehensive peace deal,
is very
and the prisoners need to be released.
Yeah, I guess we missed the part that you are not also allowed to go to Azerbaijan to represent Ruben Bartanian in the court. How does this affect your ability to defend him effectively?
Well, it obviously makes it impossible for me to defend him because I can't get direct information from him myself. I did apply to the court, to the Prosecutor General's office for permission to come and to see my client as well as to be present in the court for the trial. Not obviously as an Azeri lawyer, I'm not qualified to practice law in Azerbaijan, but even under Azeri law, an international lawyer can provide advice to a person who is detained in Azerbaijan about international law standards, and this is of course what I wanted to do, and I got no response at all from the Azeri regime. This of course is another violation of international law. A person who's a criminal defendant has the right to have attorneys of their own choosing representing them, both as a matter of domestic as well as international law, and this is another very clear violation of Ruben's rights. I think one other key point I want to emphasize is that when I was first instructed to represent Ruben by him, I was given a very, very clear message that from him that I should be advocating not just for him, but for all of the Armenian political prisoners and the POWs. He was not just looking to get himself out of jail from the circumstances that he is in, and he obviously very much is in strong solidarity with the other former Artsakh officials that are detained, as well as with the POWs, and he really wants everyone to come home, and this is what we've been doing all around the world while we're talking about Ruben's case and what he's going through as emblematic of the abuses that are happening. We always, in every place we have discussions publicly and privately, talk about how all of them need to be freed, all of them need to be able to come home.
We all are waiting for that moment, but how soon do you think this will happen?
Well, I wish I could predict the future. I think we all do. And I know how desperate the circumstances are for all of the Armenian prisoners and their families who are living through hell on a daily basis. I know from many experiences representing political prisoners that the uncertainty and the suffering is a daily existence. Every day, the families wake up wondering how their loved ones are doing. They go to bed thinking about their loved ones, right? And this is just a constant source of enormous and ongoing pain. So I feel, as Ruben's lawyer, of course, a dramatic sense of urgency on his behalf and all the others. I'm more optimistic now than I've been throughout the last 2 years. I think a lot is going on behind the scenes, things that I'm aware of as well as things that I'm not aware of. And I think the most important thing is that I'm convinced that this has been made a top priority by President Trump and his administration, and they are very focused on this despite all of the other things happening in the world. In all the discussions I've had over time, it's been consistently reinforced to me that this is a top priority, and I'm convinced, although I can't get into any details, by the information that I've received, that this is in fact the case. So I think that there's reason to be cautiously optimistic. Obviously, I'm never more than cautiously optimistic in this kind of work, but the bottom line is that we have no choice but to continue to act, to continue to speak out, to continue to advocate, for all of the Armenian prisoners. We have no choice. The only way they're going to come home is by speaking up and speaking loudly and demanding that their rights be respected, demanding that they come home to their families. And without that kind of public advocacy, then there's no hope at all. So I am optimistic. I do believe that we'll see them home. I can't give you, of course, a time frame for that, but what I can say is that it is. This is not a blank check for Aliyev to take whatever time he would like. There are obviously time limits being placed on him in terms of the expectations of what he's going to do and when and how. And his failure to act alone will trigger actions by the Trump administration, by other governments around the world. He doesn't have an unlimited amount of time before there are going to be consequences for his decisions. But I would also say that there's a lot he wants from Washington, as I said. So I think that obviously when you think about these kinds of situations, you need to make sure that the dictator in question here, Aliyev, understands that there could be serious consequences if he doesn't act, but that there are also incentives for him to take positive action. And it's really up to him to decide where to go. But what's quite clear to me is that the status quo is not going to be acceptable for very much longer. And ultimately, he's going to have to make a decision about which way to go. And in light of the way that President Trump has been conducting his foreign policy, if I were him, I'd be worried. I can just say from all the conversations I've been having, because President Trump is quite unpredictable in how he thinks about engaging with world leaders. And, Aliyev could very much find himself on the wrong side of the president, which is not a place that one wants to find themselves these days.
Hopefully in the future we'll have some good news.
I hope so, and I think we have to just keep working at it every day.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Genser, Ruben Bartanians, International Legal Advisor and Counsel.